Chapter 1, Part 1. As we get started for this semester, Chapter 1 is a brief introduction to a variety of concepts that we will expand upon in later chapters. So, Chapter 1 is just a little entry point. We'll touch upon some key terms and describe them in more detail later on in the semester. Biology is the scientific study of all organisms on planet Earth. And in fact, any word that ends with ology means scientific study of. And in biology, we have many subdisciplines, such as zoology, with the scientific study of animals, or ecology, with the scientific study of the environment and the relationship of organisms in the environment. So there are quite a few subdisciplines underneath the large umbrella of the scientific study of all organisms on planet Earth, biology. So it's a big topic, and we'll have to touch upon quite a wide variety of different concepts. So there's a huge breadth of information, lots of concepts to learn about in general biology. It's a foundation course. In fact, it's a 2-semester sequence in most colleges and universities because it does cover so many topics. For tens of thousands of years, human beings have been observing the natural world. Here's an example of some prehistoric cave paintings that our ancestors drew, and very rich in artistic color and very precise in anatomy, or the actual appearance of these animals, roughly 20,000 years ago. This is long before human beings started to create concepts and express them in what we call writing. So we really are not certain why our ancient ancestors illustrated these animals on the cave walls in different parts of the world, but we do have this glimpse into the past of the fact that human beings have always appreciated and certainly recognized all other kinds of organisms that were living around them. If we go back to roughly 384 BCE, we see the birth of an individual by the name of Aristotle in ancient Greece. He actually now is considered to be the father of natural sciences. He was a serious individual who observed and tried to make sense about everything he saw, and today would even be considered possibly sort of a Renaissance person, because he not only studied the biological organisms around him, but also politics, poetry, rhetoric, geology, astronomy, ethics, and developed what we think today is, or we recognize today, as the foundation of Western philosophical thought. In sciences in general, the concept and the practice of good ethical behavior and conduct can trace its way back to Aristotle. And it is important that we have good ethical interactions with one another, which means honest, upfront, and no falsification or ignorance of what he would recognize as the truth or what is real. Because of Aristotle's concepts, and it's not just Aristotle, but other ancient Greek philosophers have shared their knowledge and passed that along over the millennia, but also logic. Logic is a particular format of evaluating and essentially thinking. We have 2 concepts of logic that we'll describe in a little more detail as we move along: inductive and deductive reasoning, which in the natural sciences, which includes the biological sciences, we use as a foundation to proceed and try to reveal what is all around us and interpret what we see, feel, touch, and essentially use all of our senses to evaluate what's around us. The natural sciences can be divided into two main branches. The life sciences, also called the biological sciences, are where we are headed for the semester. The physical sciences are subdivided into other branches that include physics, chemistry, astronomy, and earth sciences. And for some of these major categories of life science and physical science, there are areas in which they overlap, or they certainly can sort of share or provide extra information or knowledge that can be used in all variety of disciplines. So these are not what we would call silos of scientific study, where one does not interact with the other. Instead, these are communities of scientists who, for some, are going to focus on one particular concept or area of study, but is not exclusive to sharing or providing some kind of information for the other branches. This semester we'll take a look at the diversity of life. There's an incredible amount of diversity on Earth, and what scientists have been interested in, going all the way back to Aristotle, is how organisms are related to one another, or even if they are. Some organisms look very similar to one another. Let's say if we take a look at all roses. Well, all roses, when you take a first look at the flower, you can certainly see how they're very similar. But if you take a closer look at the petals and the leaves and the stems and how the branches are arranged, there are some differences. Well, that means there's some kind of relatedness. These are not identical organisms, but they certainly seem to be closely related. The study of biological relatedness is called phylogeny. And to determine phylogeny, or biological relatedness, we have to take a look at the evolutionary history. There are various mechanisms that biologists now recognize are valid, reproducible. We can provide procedures or experiments to document or just essentially give examples of how these mechanisms really work. And one of those mechanisms that we recognize that's part of the process of biological growth and reproduction is evolution. It's a mechanism of adaptation and associating with one another and growing and having some changes occur. So evolution is a mechanism that's very dynamic and has played a key role in all of the diversity of different organisms that we see here on Earth. Up to about the late 1960s, early 1970s, biologists had grouped organisms together in what we would describe as kingdoms. There was always problems trying to classify or group certain types of organisms in particular kingdoms. Kingdoms were major, large groups of organisms with some very common general characteristics, such as plants and animals. In fact, the kingdoms of plants and animals were the first two kingdoms originally developed by our ancient scientists that we recognize today, and up through even fairly modern times. We get to the 20th century, though, and we start to discover that there are organisms that seem to defy grouping or classification in those kingdoms. And some of the scientists that were key in finding those unique organisms and their characteristics were microbiologists. In the 1960s, a microbiologist by the name of Carl Woese and his colleagues determined that these unique kinds of organisms could really only be distinguished by unique biochemical structures in the what we call cells in the organisms themselves that we call ribosomal RNA. Don't worry about those concepts yet. We'll talk about them in more detail later. But needless to say, Carl Woese used these biochemical footprints, if you will, and determined relatedness or phylogenetic arrangements, and developed what we now recognize as the phylogenetic tree, or the tree of relatedness. It actually doesn't look like a tree as much as it looks like a shrub or a bush. because we got lots of branches. And that's what the microbiologists were trying to point out. There are lots of these tiny little sub-branches in the tree of life, and we really could organize all these organisms into three major branches, if you will. The three major branches that we'll talk about this semester are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And notice the little star, you are here, is in that branch of the shrub or tree of life that we call eukarya. Lots of other types of organisms that we are very familiar with, like plants and animals, also occupy that branch of the domain eukarya. If we take a closer look at the three domains, domain bacteria, archaea, and eukarya, we get into the domain eukarya and we can divide those organisms into different kingdoms. Again, looking at very general, broad characteristics. We have a relatedness between plants, animals, fungi, and protista, but if we trace our ancestry all the way back between the three domains, what's described in terms of biochemical relatedness is what's thought of as the first living ancestral structure we call a cell. This goes back billions of years and again is based on reproducible experimental evidence based on the biochemical footprints that we find in every organism and every cell here on Earth. So if we take a look at the three kingdoms in a little bit more detail, as we will through the semester, we'll find we can divide them up into smaller and smaller groups. So we start out with a domain that's a very general, common characteristic among organisms, and then we start to look at more specialized characteristics. And that's how we break them down or group them into smaller and smaller, more well-defined groups, starting with domains, then going to kingdoms, then divisions or phyla, and farther down until we get to what are described as the very unique groups that are genus and species. That's a large part of what biologists do. Is some biologists, that's what they spend their entire careers performing, different types of studies or research projects to determine relatedness and just how closely or distantly related different organisms are and where to place them in the larger scheme of the phylogenetic tree. Some examples of individuals or organisms from some of the different domains, and we'll expand on those concepts as we move through the semester. Here we have an example of organisms from the domain Archaea. Archaea is a type of organism that we usually find down at the bottom of the ocean near hydrothermal vents. We also find other kinds of types of organisms in the domain bacteria, which can be seen grown on sort of these rocky structures called stromatolites. Stromatolites are some of the oldest examples of organisms found on Earth. You can find stromatolites with the archaea and the cyanobacteria growing on the surface of these rocky structures in a variety of places all over the world, including Australia, Mexico, and even sort of the Indian Ocean, places in those areas. An example of an organism in the domain bacteria that you've probably heard about, it's a very common one, is called Escherichia coli. It does have a nickname. We call it E. coli. And it's a commonly found organism in the intestinal tract of mammals. It helps to aid in the absorption of nutrients, provides us with certain types of vitamins, and is one of the beneficial organisms that we generally find in the mammalian intestine. We talk about mammals. What are mammals? Well, mammals are certain types of animals. And that's where we get into the domain Eukarya. In the domain Eukarya, we have very large groups that are then divided up into smaller groups that we call plants, animals, fungi, and protists. Plants and animals, most students have no problem recognizing those. Those are the flowers at the bottom left, the chimpanzee in the middle right, and even the bees at the top left. For fungi, students don't always recognize fungi, which would be examples of molds grown on the forgotten food in your refrigerator or not bread left on the counter in your cupboard. Also mushrooms that we see in the top right. Those are types of fungi. The protists are the tiny single-celled organisms that we find associated with aquatic or water-rich environments like oceans, lakes, ponds, and streams that are often generally described as plankton. And that's illustrated on the left-hand side of the screen, and even an example in the lower right. So lots of diversity in the domain Eukarya.